A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. The son became angry. When he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, "Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. You never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fattened calf." He said to him, "My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead, has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." When I was a kid, I was an avid reader, by surprise, and few books captured my young imagination more than the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Now, for those who have never had the privilege of reading these books, they were adventure stories told in far-off exotic places. At certain points in the narrative, the reader had to choose between two options. For instance, the text might read, "You've come to the entrance of a cave. If you go into the cave, turn to page 34. If you run back home, turn to page 76. The choices that the reader makes impacts the narrative, for good or for bad. And I'll admit that if my choice turned out to be a bad one, as it often was, I turned back to where I had been in the book and went down the other path. The older son in today's gospel is likewise presented with a choice of his own. His father invites him into the banquet held to welcome home his younger brother, who had gone off and lived a lavish, wasteful life, only to return in desperation. Should the older brother choose to welcome his brother as his father did, or should he continue to reject him? We don't know what the brother chooses in the end, so we're free to speculate about what he should do regarding his brother. By extension, we're invited to consider our response to those who were formerly part of our church family when they return. Do we reject them, or are we reconciled with them? In this parable, we are invited to be reconciled with those who have come back to the fold or those who have led morally problematic lives. The ending of the parable we just heard is surprising. We humans like to know how stories end. For example, most of us can't forget the ending of the film Inception, which cut to black before a spinning top could let us know whether the final scene took place in reality or in a dream. If the parable of the prodigal son was a movie, it would likewise cut to black before the older son has a chance to respond to his father's invitation. Christ leaves that tension unresolved, and for good reason. We, you and me, all of us, are invited to respond with the elder son about whether or not we will be reconciled with those returning to the church's fold. I think an example from contemporary theater might help us understand. John Patrick Shanley's one-act play, Doubt, ends without any clear resolution. We don't know exactly what happened. The playwright reportedly said that the second act of this one-act play took place in the lobby outside as the patrons debated among themselves which characters were in the right and which were in the wrong. By refusing to give us a clear-cut ending, this parable allows us to become part of the story. Christ throws the question to us. What would you do? He asks. It seems as if we are given two options, two paths from which we are to choose. The first is the path of rejection, the rejection of the returned brother. And this is what the elder brother does, at least initially. He will not join the party. His father has to come out of the banquet to speak with him and tries to convince him to put aside the bad blood, to welcome home a brother who was as good as dead. The older brother cannot join the celebration if he rejects his brother. In this rejection, he makes himself a reproach, much like Israel, the nation of Israel, in our first reading. While the reproach of Israel stands, they cannot celebrate the Passover, the great Jewish festival of God's redemption of Israel from Egypt. And they can't enter the promised land towards which they've been traveling for a whole generation. The reproach holds them back from celebration and from God's will for them. For us, when we reject those returning, those making baby steps on their way back to communion, we are making ourselves a reproach. We cut ourselves off from the community, from the church, from our brothers and sisters, and from Christ who gives us life. The second path which the elder son and us can choose is that of reconciliation. Reconciliation would allow us to become ambassadors of Christ. Now let's remember that in the world, ambassadors represent nations and their leaders. And according to St. Paul in today's second reading, Christ wants us all to represent him in the world. To illustrate the kind of reconciliation he wants us to show, he gives us in this parable an example to show us the way. The father of the two brothers is the figure of reconciliation in this story. He welcomes his son home, no questions asked. Likewise, God welcomes back sinners who seek him in even the smallest, slightest way. He starts the party, and we're welcome to join the celebration. Reconciliation allows us to enter the banquet and celebrate with the Father, with our brothers and our sisters, and with the whole community. We see this also in our first reading. When Israel is reconciled with God, this reproach is dropped. They are able to celebrate the Passover and enter into the promised land. The banquet commences when reconciliation begins. That was true then. It is true now. We don't know how the brother responds. That tension is not resolved. Christ thrusts the story onto us. We must decide for ourselves not only what the brother would do, but what we should do when this happens in our lives and in our community. What we should do when the lost brother or sister comes home. God asks for our response. Will it be a rejection that leads to a reproach, or to reconciliation and ambassadorship? God, who is most excellent, shows us the most excellent way, that of reconciliation. He even gives us this great season of reconciliation, Lent. In a few weeks, we will begin a new round of our Catholics Coming Home sessions, the program that seeks to help former Catholics come back into the church. And some of these folks have been out of the church for years for one reason or another. Divorce, remarriage, pain, suffering. Will we be ready to be reconciled with them? And let's not forget our catechumens candidates. Will we be ready to welcome them into the church in a few weeks at the Easter Vigil, regardless of their histories? And let's not stop there. Forgiveness and reconciliation extend beyond these church doors. Are we willing to forgive that jerk at work who stole the credit for our hard work, or the idiot who parked in our reserved parking spot? The gospel for today, indeed this whole liturgy, invites us to spend some time this week in being agents of God's reconciliation in the world by forgiving others whatever needs forgiving. God can even work with our baby steps towards forgiveness, but we have to work We have to give him something to work with. You may first have to be reconciled to God ourselves. We may have to be reconciled to God ourselves. And that's okay. There are many opportunities for us to encounter the sacrament of reconciliation before Easter. Our reconciliation with God will give us the strength and the grace to be agents of reconciliation in this world that is in desperate need of forgiveness and reconciliation. Response, rejection, reconciliation. God has already made up his mind. He is going to welcome back the lost. And while he would like for us to welcome them back too, he isn't going to force us. In this parable, he asks for our response. We have to make a choice. Not making a choice is a choice. Delaying is a choice. The conversation between a father and his eldest son is thrust upon us. We must respond. Rejection or reconciliation. Choose your own adventure.